Hey you, Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend, I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Last night, on my way home from work, I stopped at a Circle K, a convenience store near the subway station. I purchased 3 local craft beers, and I went home and drank them. And shockingly, I am still here today. Nothing bad has happened yet. Now, for those of you listening outside of Ontario, you should know that a couple of weeks ago, it became legal to sell beer and wine and coolers in convenience stores in Ontario, much like my Circle K. Now, this was actually a pretty big deal. Ontario has a long history of weird booze regulations, and this was, at long last, a pretty normal one for once. However, Ontario being Ontario, we still couldn't do this without first incurring hundreds of millions of dollars in costs, sparking weeks of outrage about the dangers of selling beer in the places where it's sold in many other nations and provinces, fretting about drunk driving and stores located near schools, and all manner of other things. But we got it done, and also, while we were at it, we made it legal for you to buy your beer in a 7-Eleven and then sit down and drink it. Right there. Why? Well, why not? Welcome to Ontario. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Matt Gurney is a journalist and commentator. He is the co-founder of The Line, an independent publication which you can find at readtheline.ca. He always likes to come here when we're going to talk about Toronto. Hi, Matt.
Great to be here. I like to come here to talk about anything, but sure, let's talk Toronto.
Well, I guess we're talking about Ontario in general. But maybe first, for those outside of the area, the provincial government, it was announced on Monday, is being investigated by the Financial Accountability Office over a booze deal. Can you just give us the Coles notes on that?
The Coles notes basically go something like this. Back in 2018, when it was still Kathleen Wynne who was Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford and the Conservatives campaigned on reforming the regulations around alcohol sales and distribution in Ontario and putting beer and coolers and things like that into corner stores, convenience stores, was a campaign promise in his original majority run. And then some weird things happened during his first majority. And then he was reelected in 2022 with an even bigger majority, but the booze promise had never been delivered, and he kind of rushed it out all in a hurry in the last few months. And not only was there an aggressive timeline on this, he even accelerated it further during the LCBO strike. LCBO striking workers had said that, trying to stop the plan, which had already been announced for a target date a few months from now, if I remember correctly. They announced that stopping that was one of their goals. And what Ford did instead was just basically said, oh yeah, well, in that case, we're just going to move things forward. That was political, what he did. And the speculation is that he's doing this because he wants to call an early election and he wants to be able to tick this box. But doing it early meant we had to break an existing contract with The Beer Store, which is a private sector organization that sort of exists as the beer distribution and wholesaler for Ontario. So that contract had to be broken and revised, and it's going to be somewhere around $250 million. Liberals in campaign literature have said it's as much as $1 billion in terms of cancellation fees and all the related charges. That's what the Financial Accountability Office is being tapped to look into here. I don't know what the final number is going to be, but no, I mean, there is something legitimately to look at here because the contract was going to be up in like a year and a bit anyway. So we could have just waited a little and not spent the money to break the contract.
Right. Well, here's the thing. I asked you that off the top first so that we could establish, there are financial penalties in here, and one can debate on how the government should spend taxpayer money or not, but also just so listeners from outside of Ontario could get a taste of 3 minutes of incredibly convoluted policy that ultimately ends with you being able to buy a beer at a 7-Eleven.
And the incredible thing is too, there is a craft brewer in my neighborhood, and you can go directly to the brewery and buy some of the product. They are allowed to sell that in their own store, their own retail outlet. But if I go to the convenience store, that is 2 blocks west and a couple blocks north of that brewer, up until 2 weeks ago, it would not have been legal for me to buy that beer there. I could have bought it at the local grocery store. I could have bought it at a local LCBO, which is the provincial liquor wholesaler. I could have bought it at a beer store. But a convenience store that is a pretty good Frisbee toss away from the actual site where the beer is brewed would not have been allowed to sell it. Now, it is allowed to sell it, but it still has to go through the weird regulatory system and distribution system. So I'm not going to say that we've entirely rationalized the system, but it is at least from the consumer's perspective, the guy who wants to go out and buy a couple of beers or buy some coolers or buy some wine, it has been simplified kind of at the point of sale, but the regulations in this province are still pretty complicated. To be honest, I think I probably know a lot more about this than most people, but I still think I've probably only scratched the surface.
We talked to a reporter from City News, Richard Southern, during that LCBO strike, and he gave us the entire history of Ontario's liquor laws dating back to Prohibition. And I was sitting there with my mouth open for a lot of it because, as an adult in this province, I'm familiar with where you can buy beer and wine and where you cannot. But the idea that it has gone through so many iterations to end up, and is it fair to say this, Matt, to end up approximately where every other Western nation is?
I mean, I think your mileage will vary on that one because there's so many different jurisdictions, either national or subnational. Some of them have pretty weird and archaic rules. But I think what Ontario has now done is it has moved into essential parity with its neighbors, including Quebec and New York and the northeastern United States.
Right.
And there are still jurisdictions in parts of Europe which would be much more liberal than us. And there are still, I think, some Canadian jurisdictions that are more conservative than us. I don't pretend to know, to have a score sheet at hand of exactly how every province is doing this. But at the very least, we can say we are not doing anything radically different than the province next to us or the state directly to our south. We are now doing exactly the same thing as them. And, civil anarchy and chaos has yet to ensue.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that because there were some fairly strenuous objections to this, and I'd like to hear from you. What ground do you think those have, if any?
We started talking about the finances. I think it is a completely legitimate, rational point to go, we should not have spent hundreds of millions of dollars at least to accelerate this plan by a year and change. That to me is a completely valid concern. I don't particularly care. I'm not losing sleep about this. But if someone says to me, yeah, Matt, I think it was time that we updated our liquor laws, but I think spending a few $100 million on it was a waste, I'll go, yeah, okay. That completely fair to me. And then I will wish that person a life of emotional and spiritual fulfillment, right? I don't have any problem with that. But a lot of the criticisms of this are sort of well, it's a waste of money. Okay, it's fair. And also, don't you know that we'll have people going to the local Circle K, downing 7 bottles of wine and then hopping into their hot rod and driving it at full speed into the nearest orphanage. And it's really interesting, and it's something you have talked about. I know you have, and I've talked about this as well. Some of the most socially conservative people in the world are Ontario and especially Toronto progressives.
Yeah.
Where me being a right of center guy, reasonably moderately so, I take a pretty laissez-faire attitude on someone's libations or vices, and I believe that we should regulate and license distribution of harmful materials, and that we should have age limits and all those usual things. But much beyond that, if somebody wants to drink some beer or if somebody wants to have some wine, I don't think it's my place to sit at home fretting about exactly how much they're having. And I'm not saying this to deny the social ills of alcohol or the social costs of alcohol, whether it's impaired driving or domestic violence or even just health issues from people who abuse that.
Right.
These are all legitimate concerns. But we, as a jurisdiction, as Ontario, I don't understand the argument that we are somehow less able or less obligated to deal with these genuine concerns while also existing within a marketplace that is generally similar to our neighbors here. Why do Ontario government officials and so much of our public commentariat seem to think that the only way Ontario can effectively deal with drunk driving or, like I said, alcoholism and substance abuse is to play the province on easy mode, which is just like, well, we're going to basically limit where alcohol can be sold. And also, I've just never understood the natural endpoint of these arguments, right? Like, you were telling me, like Richard had told you about sort of like the long history of how we wound up with Ontario alcohol regulation. If we take the arguments of the people who objected to the convenience store regulations at face value, at their merits here, why not just return alcohol into a prohibition-era, prescription-only substance? I want someone to tell me what the acceptable resting place for social harm is. And no one wants to do that. They all just get squeamish about, oh, well, if it's at a convenience store, it'll be a little bit more accessible. There are going to be incidents, and you and I are both mature enough to know this. Sooner or later, someone's going to wrap their car around a lamppost, or worse, after getting drunk on beer that they bought at a convenience store. It's going to happen. The question I have is, why are we so convinced that that same person would not have just, in the absence of that convenience store, gotten tanked at the local pub or the grocery store or from the brewer retail or from the LCBO? I just, in a year or two, we're going to be able to look at impaired driving statistics and other stats like that, mainly impaired driving, and we'll be able to take a look at whether or not there was some huge spike recorded in early September 2024. My guess is, though, no, we're probably not going to see that.
Hey, you! Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activated.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend. I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.
You and I both live in Toronto. A lot of people listening to this podcast live in the big cities. There are people who will now, I am assuming, again, you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, I am assuming that there are now a whole bunch of people that will no longer have to get in their car to go acquire booze if they want it, right? You're sitting at home and the game's about to start. You've had your last beer, or you polished off a bottle of wine, and you would like one more. Now, rather, in many parts of this province, you've got to get in your car and drive 10, 15 minutes to the nearest LCBO. And maybe now you walk 2 blocks to your local convenience store. And maybe that is the flip side of making it so much more readily available.
I guess, no, I don't think that's crazy. Like, we'll see in the numbers if it comes out as a wash or not. But no, I agree with that. And I also think one of the things that my friend Chris Selly, National Post columnist, has been, like, his Twitter feed has just been spectacular the last couple of weeks, as he's really been enjoying himself on this one. But one of the things he has noted is that, in fact, the LCBO was already using a lot of convenience and corner stores as distribution hubs in parts of the province where low population density makes it probably cost prohibitive to have a standalone LCBO outlet. So you license with local corner and convenience stores, and you have them as your distributors. And as I quipped before, chaos and social anarchy is yet to ensue. Like, we have expanded into the big cities, something that has already been proven to be effective and reasonably safe, and not only in other jurisdictions, but in other parts of this jurisdiction.
How much of this is about who is actually enacting this policy? And I ask that because one of the interesting things that I've noticed in the wake of this is that a lot of the people who are really upset that Doug Ford is pushing beer into convenience stores and wine into convenience stores where people can have access to it are some of the same folks that were really upset that Toronto wouldn't let you drink in parks during the pandemic and pushed for that and pushed it because, it's classist because some people don't have a backyard to sit in and they need to be able to go somewhere and drink. And so access to consuming alcohol in public spaces was great, but being able to purchase it in normal stores is not. And the only difference I can see, and maybe I'm missing something, is who put those policies in place.
If you're missing something, I'm missing it too. I think you've nailed it. Like, if Mayor Chow had announced this, I think the outrage is different. I mean, maybe it comes from the right instead of the more progressive side. If Justin Trudeau had announced it, based on the current state of our politics, everybody, including half the Liberal caucus, would probably be denouncing it. Doug Ford denounces it, and the usual Ford haters come out and denounce it. I 100% agree with you. Like, again, you and I have already acknowledged there are going to be social trade-offs for this policy, just like there are on any policy here. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the quantity and the nature of the opposition, I, like you, have noticed that there is a great deal of overlap between the people who are very angry about this and who are very angry about anything Doug Ford does. The reality of it is, and I've quipped about this before, Doug Ford could declare tomorrow Provincial Puppy Day, and a lot of people would decide they hate dogs.
Right. And I also wonder how this makes us look. Not that Torontonians really care or Ontarians care that much, because they're a little wrapped up in their own universe, to say the least. But I wonder how other parts of Canada look to our back and forth on this issue. You mentioned the financial part of it, hundreds of millions of dollars, the political aspect of it, the whether it's genuine or feigned outrage around it, and look at it and like, guys, this is about being able to buy a 6-pack or 750 milliliters of wine. What is going on?
A former colleague of mine who was from out west told me once that he could never take someone from Ontario seriously. And he hoped I wasn't offended by that. And I sort of smiled and said, no, of course not. I don't care what anyone from outside Ontario thinks. So why would it offend me? But what he said to me was, with so much of the national media concentrated in Ontario, he was in a situation where he was able to kind of keep up with our news without being part of the actual vibe, the moment, the culture. And he told some very funny, amusing anecdotes of things that voters in Ontario, citizens in Ontario, the media in Ontario were absolutely losing their mind about, which were forgotten 30 days after being enacted. And he actually, to his credit, he had a short list of like a half dozen of them. My gut feeling is that this is going to be one of them. Now, there will be a wave of stories over the next couple of years because we'll get revised crime stats or impaired driving stats or things like that. Inevitably, a couple of drunk idiots are going to get in a brawl in the parking lot of a gas station where booze is sold, something like that. So there will be stories that will surface this. But I think for the broader public, this is something we cared about intensely for like a solid 45 minutes, and then it will just be forgotten. And one day we'll be explaining to bemused children, when I was your age, I had to go to a special government building to buy beer. And
it's like consumers distributing,
Blockbuster, right? Like it's just any example like that. Like I remember like my daughter saw a phone booth once and said, "What's that?" And I think like these generational things happen. The funny thing is too, like we're talking about the dividing generational lines here. Let's just talk about dividing jurisdictional lines. You want to know one group of Ontarians who I actually think handled this really well and failed to have some sort of collective nervous breakdown? The Greater Ottawa region. You know why? Because they could always drive to Hull and to Gatineau. And it's just like this idea that it is impossible to do what Quebec has been doing successfully without any particular problem for generations. That it's impossible to do it in Ontario. That might be a Toronto thing, but anyone in near the eastern border, they knew better.
One of the weirdest aspects of this policy that I have to ask you about, you can criticize the overall thrust of it all you want or not criticize it and just say, yeah, that's life, that's how it should be. Why did we need to include the ability to consume beer inside 7-Eleven?
So I don't know that we needed to.
Why is it in there? First of all, who's doing that? Second of all, those poor employees.
So my understanding, and this was also a bit of a head scratcher for me. Like I've never thought to myself, what would really complete this evening for me would be popping out to a 7-Eleven for a cold one. But some of the 7-Elevens in Ontario and all across North America are apparently kind of a hybrid blend between corner store and fast food restaurant. And my understanding is that those ones that do have the ability to add sort of a dedicated seating area, you will be allowed to go in to buy, I don't even know what kind of food you can buy hot at a 7-Eleven. I guess pizza, hot dogs, things like that.
Hot dogs and nachos.
Now, okay, sure. So like that stuff, you could buy that, you could buy a beer, and then you could go to like the designated alcohol consumption zone and then consume your hot 7-Eleven food and your cold beer.
The last aspect of this I want to ask you about, seriously, is at the same time as this, and this is another part of where I think some of this outrage came from, and I know the two are obviously not connected, but at the same time as this policy was being enacted, the Ontario government was attempting to close a number of safe consumption sites in the middle of the opioid crisis. And I do wonder if part of the reason that we're seeing this outrage, among some people anyway, is because of the, frankly, pretty insensitive optics of that, even though there's nothing to do with each other?
Look, I will be the first one to agree that Ontario government policy under Premier Doug Ford is often what I will charitably call discombobulated.
That's a fair word, maybe.
There are other words I would use off the air, but in respect to your show and your listeners, I'm going to be polite about it and avoid them. Doug Ford has weird priorities. I'm not gonna pretend otherwise. I'm not gonna suggest otherwise. But there's been such a bizarre push and pull on this issue for a while because you've raised supervised safe consumption sites, and I think that's fair. But there's also a third one I would bring into this as well, just to sort of go for the picture of maximum chaos here. We should add as a third item to that list the fact that Doug Ford, as he was taking power back in, again, 2018, that was right around the time of cannabis legalization. And the outgoing Liberal government had a plan to create a cannabis distribution network that would have largely mirrored the structure of the LCBO, where cannabis would have been sold to you by government employees through like a provincially owned wholesaler. And then Doug Ford came along, blew that up, and basically deregulated it and said, like, let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? And then all of a sudden, every other store in the universe was a cannabis store. And now gradual competitive forces, supply and demand, have sort of winnowed that down. But no, I mean, it's just, I think that's a really interesting point because I live in a province where supervised safe injection sites completely effectively privatized cannabis delivery and government monopoly beer distribution.
It's hard to tie all those three together in a sane way.
Yeah. Now, people are going to challenge me in that and say, well, the beer store isn't a government monopoly. Yeah, I grant that. But so we had government either owned or controlled beer monopolies, supervised fentanyl injection sites, and free market cannabis. All of those things coexisted, not only in the same time, but in the same place, because you could find examples of all of those things within a couple of miles of me. So if you were just to look at these three things and try to take a snapshot view of them and try to figure out what the people running this place actually believe, I don't think you'd be able to do that. If you were like an anthropologist from another society, if you were an alien observing from the mothership, and you were to look at like beer monopoly, free market cannabis, and supervised injection of opioids, try to imagine what you would conclude that jurisdiction's policies were on harmful substances.
I don't want to be an anthropologist studying the decisions of Ontario in the 2000s.
No, the alien mothership idea, frankly, is far more tempting these days because at least it could leave.
Matt, thank you so much for this. I wanted to chat with you about this because I knew it would be fun, but I'm glad we also got some substantive stuff out of it.
Anytime, my pleasure, and cheers.
Matt Gurney is the co-founder of The Line. Once again, you can find it at readtheline.ca. That was the big story. For more from us, including previous episodes that explore Ontario's long and strange history with alcohol regulations, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also shoot us a note for some feedback at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving a voicemail. That number is 416-935-5935. Joe Fish is the lead producer of The Big Story. Robin Simon is also a producer with us. Matt Kesselman handles our sound design. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our audience development lead. Diana Kay is our business manager. And I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings, your host and executive producer. Together, we're the Frequency Podcast Network, which makes us a division of Rogers. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful weekend. As you know by now, we've got In This Economy for you on Saturday and A Blast from the Past on Sunday, and we will be back with a fresh big story, bright and early, on Monday morning.
Hey you, Bravo's now in Canada.
I just got chills.
If you know Bravo,
I love that. You love that?
you know Vanderpump Rules,
Why does it have to get so complicated?
Summer House,
Don't activate me because you've not seen me activate it.
Below Deck,
I'm not your friend. I'm your captain.
Top Chef,
Hi, Chef.
and Housewives. Definitely Housewives.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm looking forward to this.
Bravo, now available.
It's insane.
Subscribe now with your TV service provider.
Fall in Canada has never been hotter.